right, well, thank you very much. We now come to the final panel of our six-panel event that AEI has been proud to co-sponsor with the Brookings Institution and with the Secretary's Innovation Group. The hypothesis for this panel is only fundamental reforms, pursued rapidly, can avoid a path in which an increasing proportion of people who could work are sidelined and the economy is burdened with the declining taxpayer workforce. That is going to be the subject of the discussion today. What you'll hear primarily is not an analysis of numbers and an analysis of budgetary burdens. You've heard some of that in other panels. It may be touched on. What you'll primarily hear is 4 solutions, which are meant to show different examples of what fundamental reform might look like and how it might bring people who are currently considered to be disabled back into the workforce so that they can pursue their own dreams with assistance from society, but not being sidelined into a place where they wonder what happened with their life. When I think about disability, when I think about what we do as a society right now, I frankly get horrified that whether you're somebody who is blind, or whether you're somebody who is deaf, or whether you're someone who has been the victim of a terrible spinal injury and you're now quadriplegic, or whether you are, as increasingly is the case, about half of the applicants of people who come onto the SSDI rolls are people who fit none of those traditional criteria, but people who have back pain, declining work opportunity, mental issues such as low self-esteem or clinical depression. They come to the government, they come to us, and they say, we've fallen and would like to get up. We have some issues, we have some obstacles, help us. What the government says is that if you want to work right now, we don't really have much help for you. That's what we're telling people. But if you decide that you can't work, if you decide that these burdens are too difficult for you, well then and only then, can we provide you with income support and maybe some medical support for as long as you think that you can. So basically, if you go to us today and you say, I can, we say, go out and do it. And if you say, I can't, then you're welcome to support. I think if you think that the current system that says, maybe if you're on the cusp, you should think, I can't, so that you can get our help, if you think that's a moral system, then you probably won't like the fundamental reforms that we're going to talk about. But if that bothers you in the way that it bothers me, if it bothers you that when somebody comes in tempting times, in difficult times, in trying times, and the only thing we will do for them is when they say, I can't, well then I think you're going to hear some very provocative ideas. And for me, not only are we talking about the person who has serious physical disabilities but a will of iron, who wants to overcome them and work, but a person who was featured in last week's Wall Street Journal article, a 53-year-old former truck driver who's receiving SSDI, who complains of back pain and says he can't sit in the cab anymore, he's thrown out of work, and all he knows is truck driving. And he gets a check, and he'd like to work, but no one will help him find a way, because all he knows is truck driving, and no one at the SSDI office will show him there's a different way. The 4 proposals have some similarities, and they have some important differences. We'll start with Richard Burkhauser, who's a professor of economics at Cornell University, a visiting professor at the University of Melbourne, and an adjunct scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He'll be followed by David Stapleton, who is director for the Center of Studying Disability Policies at Mathematica. He'll be followed by Jack Smolligan, branch chief of the Income Maintenance Branch and acting deputy director of the Education, Income Maintenance, and Labor Division at OMB. And our final idea reform will be presented by Jason Turner, who you've already known, the executive director of the Secretary's Innovation Group. And our session will be summarized and conclude, or we'll have a response from Doug Besheroff, professor of the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland and director of the Welfare Reform Academy. And we'll have a closing comment from Eloise Anderson, Secretary for Children and Families from the state of Wisconsin and the chair of the Secretary's Innovation Group. So allow me to present to you Richard Burkhauser.
Thank you. It's great to have 2 bites of the apple today. I got my degree at the University of Chicago, and one of my teachers was Milton Friedman. And one of the things that Friedman said is there's no such thing as a free lunch. And yet, often when we talk about disability policy, we're really talking as if there is a free lunch and that nobody pays for these things. If I don't pay for it, then somehow some other entity pays for it, and that's fine. So we heard, I thought, some wonderful comments in the last session on workers' comp. And we heard this interest in the business community in Work First. And Work First is like mother and love and whatever here. It seems we're all interested in Work First. Well, if we're so interested in Work First, why doesn't it happen? I think the answer is actually the one that Joanne Barnhart talked about just in her thing when she said, people act in response to incentives. And the problem with our integrated system, so-called integrated system, is it's not integrated. So there are ways that people can act in their own self-interest, and everybody does that, and in the end, we end up paying more money than we have to for a system that we don't particularly like. So let's go back to basic principles. Who pays for the DI program? Well, the employers pay half, and the workers pay half. So are they getting their money's worth? And why is it that in this DI program, which the employers already pay, they have the liability, they have skin in the game, why don't we have a better outcome in which it's leading to Work First? Well, the answer is because unlike the workers' compensation program, which carefully thought about incentives that would get both the employer and the worker to give up litigation in order to get some sort of guarantee of health care and benefits and return to work first, we have a system where we have DI, and go to the first slide, we have DI is envisioned as a last resort benefit after all other return to work activities have failed. So DI, if you knock on the DI door, you don't get health care, you don't get assistance in accommodation and rehabilitation. All you get, if you're lucky, is a check. And last Friday, I'm going to steal one of your statements, what we have is a system that says, we really can't help you in the way we need to, so we're going to throw money at you. I love that sentence last Friday when you said it. It's not my fault. I'm just repeating what she said. I didn't say that. I was just saying this. Why is that? Well, the answer is that we currently have, or employers currently provide long-term disability insurance for about 33% of their workers. So for 67% of workers, they don't have any case managers. They don't have anybody who's there to do the sorts of things that should be done at the time that it matters, at the time of onset of a disability. So what they do at some point is they knock on the DI door, and they don't get that management. They get, if they wait long enough, money thrown at them. So now, it's sort of easy to describe the problem, but what's the solution? Well, the solution is, I think, for employers to recognize that employers, you're paying for this system. The problem is the employers who do the right thing and actually have a long-term disability program actually are subsidizing those employers who don't. Those employers who do the right thing and provide Work First, you're subsidizing the employers that don't. Now, how did we offset that with regard to workers' compensation? Well, we defined exactly who we're going to take care of. We're going to take care of those people who experience the onset of a disability on the job. And then we said, we are going to, that was a great term, I love these words, merit, what was that, the jargon term, merit rated. I used to call that experience rated, meaning if you don't do a damn thing, we're going to raise your, we're going to raise your premiums. But I like merit, okay. So I want a merit system. I want the DI rolls, the DI tax rates to be merit rated. I want people who, in fact, do provide Work First, do slow down their movement of their workers onto the DI rolls to be rewarded by having to pay less in terms of taxes, and I want those firms that don't to have to pay more. That's basically the idea. My proposal actually is a cost neutral. At worst, it's cost neutral, but if we actually believe that Work First actually saves money, All I'm saying is let's continue to do the good stuff we're doing with workers' comp, but now let's increase the group of people we do it for, and that is for all people who experience the onset of a disability, whether they're on the job or whether they're not on the job. Note that this is not an increase in the burden to all employers. It is a shifting of the burden to those employers who don't, in fact, provide the kinds of managerial activities that we've heard so much about in the workers' comp plan. So that's my proposal for my simple idea for reform. SSI just doesn't provide this case management. Currently, the system is perverse in that employers are actually encouraged to move their disabled workers onto the DI once they fail to get them into work first programs, and for the 33% who have long-term disability, they're out there just with the lawyers helping to get them onto their roles because then they don't have to pay for them. That's just the way we set up the system. Expect it, it's going to happen. Okay, so what's the solution? As I said, let's put the real cost of DI on the employers via experience rating. What that will lead to, I believe, is greater employer private insurance companies coming in, their best position to do the evaluation benefit work that we've been talking about. Let's get the private insurance companies working up front, and if you experience rate, if you put that burden more explicitly on individual firms, they're much more likely to get into the private insurance business. That's exactly what the Dutch did, and it dramatically reduced the number of people coming onto the rolls in Holland. Okay, so now that I've solved the DI problem, what do we do with SSI? Well, we have the same problem with SSI. We don't have the incentives correct. What can we do? What's the problem here? Well, SSI, quite frankly, should have never been SSA should have never been chosen as the agency to administer SSI. They don't know anything about managing low-income families. This is a welfare program, for goodness sake. Now, instead of throwing money at people who are in the workforce, now we're throwing money at people who are low-income people, and we learned from TANF that that's the wrong way to go. So let's get SSA out of the welfare business. SSI is a welfare program closer to TANF than to old age insurance in design. States now are encouraged to move. Right now, states are encouraged to move their TANF population onto SSI because they get to keep their block grant and the Fed pays twice for it. We, the citizens, pay for it. This is crazy. It's also crazy, by the way, for an SSI Kids program to provide welfare benefits for a family dependent on the failure of their children. Think about that for a second. If I suggested, let's have a program like this, who'd raise their hand and say, great idea, this is the way we can do it. So what I would do is, in a heartbeat, I would continue the way we started, shift, instead of just shifting TANF to the states, let the states get the SSI benefits, do the block grants, do the kinds of regs that you need to make sure they do the right thing, but you're much more likely to get an outcome in which those benefits are aimed at getting the kids into the workforce at age 18 rather than slowing them down until they get to 18 so that the parents can get these welfare benefits. What we shouldn't do, let's stop doing SSI demonstrations, testing the efficacy of policy options, encouraging those on the DI roles to leave. That is too late. If we're talking about a disability program for people who aren't able to work, why do we make them spend 2 years proving they can't work before we then provide them with some incentives to work? Let's move it up front. That's the way to go. The rest of the stuff is trivial versus those points. Thank you.
Before we jump to Dave, come on up, Dave. I just wanted to comment when talking about SSI, there's a really heartbreaking article in the New York Times a month or so ago by Nicholas Kristof talking about a family that pulled their child out of a reading class because the child receives a disability classification because of their subpar reading skills, and consequently the family gets $600 and something a month in SSI payments, which in the Appalachians goes far, and they actually depended on. That's exactly the sort of perverse incentive that case management and work first, or ability first in the case of kids, would forestall. Dave, it's your shot.
Sure. So I think there are a lot of good ideas about how to reform the system, but I've been around for a long time and we're just not making very good progress. And so my proposal really has to do with how we can jumpstart the process of moving reform forward, building the evidence base so that we can build the support needed to really have policy change. So what I'm going to do is state two goals for disability policy reform that I think we can all agree on, and then describe what I think Congress could do right now to accelerate the progress towards those goals. The work that I'm talking about is written in the 3 articles I've written with David Mann, my colleague. So here are my 2 disability reform goals. You may not agree with the semantics exactly, but the first one is increase employment opportunities and outcomes for people with disabilities. I suspect that nobody fundamentally disagrees with this goal at all. The second one is to reduce growth in public expenditures to support working-age people with disabilities. Now, if you listen to some people, you think they'd like us to spend more, not less, than we actually do to accelerate growth. But I think for those people even, they're coming to recognize that the rapid growth in health expenditures for this population are undermining political support for the programs that they're so dear to them. So I think eventually they'll come around to the idea that we really need to reduce growth in public expenditures. Now, some might think that these 2 goals are mutually exclusive. Well, we argue that they can, in fact, go hand in hand, and we think that many others in this room would agree. The structure of the disability support system today is so fundamentally flawed that there are significant opportunities to increase employment and reduce expenditure growth at the same time. What we really need to do is to figure out how to realize those opportunities without causing a lot of damage in the process. So our proposal addresses 3 specific barriers that we've identified to reform. One is a legacy of distrust. For reasons that many of you are familiar with, disability advocates do not trust federal agencies. They do not trust Congress. They do not trust state governments to move forward with disability policy reform. And I'm not going to get into the reasons for that, but I think that it's fundamentally true that no significant proposal will get through Congress unless there is substantial support from the disability community. Second, the way we finance the programs today creates incentives that discourage work and encourage expenditure growth, just the opposite of what we'd like to do. The disability programs are replete with examples of financial incentives that encourage people with disabilities, government agencies, administrators, and an array of third parties to behave in ways that reduce employment and increase expenditures. Third, as the Government Accountability Office has documented quite extensively, the disability support system is highly fragmented. It's not just SSDI by a long shot. There's a myriad of federal and state programs, agencies that have responsibility for various pieces of supports for the very same population. Over time, each federal or state agency might try to improve what it does on its own, but the big sources of potential gains from policy change are reforms that cut across the agencies and federal state jurisdictions. So because of this fragmentation, our proposal is concerned with the entire public support system for the working age population with disabilities, not just SSDI. One obstacle, of course, to adopting a proposal like ours is that responsibilities for the full system is fragmented in Congress, just as it is in the agencies, among congressional committees and subcommittees. So those committees are going to have to work together if they want to move policy forward according to our proposal. So our proposal has 4 parts. We see this as congressional legislation with 4 parts. One is the goals, which I've already talked about. The second is a management and oversight system. And the third is a transparent accounting system. And the fourth is a waiver, a set of waivers, waiver options, I should say. So getting right into the management oversight provisions, I think this is the most challenging part of this proposal. It's the establishment of a strong federal entity that would have management and oversight responsibilities. I don't see this as a new federal agency at all. You might want to call it a disability waiver board or something like that. It's not a new agency, but I think it needs to be long-term and perhaps even permanent. And I think it must report in some fashion directly to Congress and to the White House. This waiver board would establish and lead the reform process. It would grant cross-cutting waivers, cross-agency waivers from current programs to states, localities, private entities, and even to federal agencies themselves. It would coordinate any cross-cutting activities under these waivers. It would monitor the disability populations that are going to be affected by the waivers. It would establish and operate an appeals process so that people who are subject to the waivers have a chance to complain if something really nasty happens to them. and it would support continued improvement through evaluation, dissemination, and technical assistance. It would also have the power to make mid-course corrections to waivers if things go badly. Oh, here we go. Sorry, behind myself. So in addition to having a federal oversight board, or waiver board, as I've described, we also think there needs to be some kind of an independent consumer review board. The National Council on Disability could potentially, it already exists, it could potentially serve this function, but people with disabilities, advocates always say nothing about us without us. There has to be a place for a voice of this community in the reform process. And finally, I think each state is going to need to have its own board that mirrors the federal board, because it's going to need to make decisions about waivers that are going to be implemented in the state. The second set of provisions concerns full and transparent accounting. So our idea here is to have a rolling 10-year budget projection for all expenditures at the federal level to support the working age population with disabilities. So it encompasses all federal and state expenditures. Initially, it would be based on current law. And we could also divide it into the state level so we know how much is going to be spent for each state. And we could include projections for state matching dollars that are required under current federal law. And we would update this thing annually. At the end of each year, we'd actually do an accounting to see what was actually spent. Now, because most of the funds in this budget would come from entitlements, SSDI, Medicare, Medicaid, SSI, there is no limit on total annual expenditures. But if Congress decides that it must, in fact, reduce growth on overall expenditures, it can do so by imposing an overall annual limit. Gradually, we think it would be a mistake to do that for the first few years, but once the system is established and seems headed in the right direction, then a limit that gradually reduces expenditure growth would serve to accelerate the reform process. Finally are the waivers. So there are many, many different options here, but the default option is to do nothing. So a state could propose to just continue operating under the current system, continuing to administer it. As long as the money is in the budget to do that, that could continue. If the budget gets tighter, Congress does push to reduce expenditure growth, then the state could potentially decide within the current system, within the current structure, where it's going to cut benefits, et cetera. It would be a transparent process. It would be done at the state level, not at the national level. And it probably would be better than the process that I think we're going to be undergoing otherwise, which is going to be federal cutting of benefits in a way that's not transparent. But the preferred option, of course, is that states and localities and even private entities and also the federal agencies themselves would propose waivers that are designed to improve economic outcomes for the disability population. Again, to reduce public growth and public expenditures as well. And I think these would have to start small. Try them at the county level, build some confidence that they're going to work or stop when they don't work, and discard those initial failures. What might the waivers allow? Well, I guess I just shut myself off. Here we go. So, well, there's just a long, long list, and I don't have time to go over all of them. I think you'll see things on this list you've heard about already today. I think that an important thing is that once this system is in place, or even it's contemplated that it will be in place, there are going to be proposals just coming out of the woodwork. Some of them won't be very good, and the waiver board serves the function of not allowing those ones that aren't very good and working with the ones that have promised to get them to a point where, in fact, it looks like the results would be favorable. So that's it. Thank you.
Jack.
These recommendations are reflecting work that Jeff Liebman and I did while I was on sabbatical from OMB, and they don't necessarily reflect the views of OMB. Overall, our assessment is that the disability programs are not out of control. The programs have grown, but most of that growth can be explained by understandable factors. That said, the programs do have serious flaws. They provide the wrong incentives for all the major players inside and outside the system. The result is too many people receiving the wrong type of assistance, essentially lifetime cash support, if they never again do significant work. assigning millions of people to incomes near or below the poverty line. Discouraging people from working also keeps them from realizing the many beneficial health and social outcomes of work. To respond to this, we propose 2 tracks: some immediate reforms to improve the disability determination process and longer-term demonstration projects to expand what we know about what can be done. And I'm otherwise impaired on this. There we go, thank you. Okay? Okay. Oh, okay, great, thank you. Sorry. On demonstrations, our focus is early intervention to identify the right types of assistance. There's just so much that we don't know. What is clear is that interventions focused on people already awarded long-term cash benefits are unlikely to be successful. This is true from both past US experience and from other countries in the OECD. So we first propose a demonstration within SSA's existing process. This intervention would require a robust screening tool to identify candidates who would otherwise be likely to be determined eligible, but who still have significant work potential. The experiment should be concentrated in specific communities so we can leverage local organizations and communicate a consistent work-first message through multiple sources. This is an opportunity to test different types of assistance. For example, could a short-term emergency cash benefit be combined with longer-term wage subsidies to result in better outcomes for the individual? Would a time-limited benefit be more effective? However, we do know that by the time a person has applied for Social Security benefits, in many cases, it can be too late to really effectively intervene with the individual. So therefore, our second proposal is to give new authority for states to test very specific strategies to help particular at-risk populations. We are not proposing open-ended state flexibilities. One example from last week is the integrated placement support intervention that Bob Drake discussed with the same audience. And in the IPS model, where vocational assistance is embedded into the mental health treatment team. And through rigorous evaluations, multiple researchers have seen improved outcomes. In many cases, not substantial enough that the person would not be able to require assistance, but substantial enough that a wage supplement, like a disability work tax credit similar to the EITC, but administered on an ongoing basis, might be enough to leverage the person into an environment where they're working and only relying on a limited subsidy. But if you look currently at Medicaid and the Department of Education VR stovepipes, we have a complicated ability to be able to bring an intervention like that, despite all the rigorous evidence, to bring that into becoming the standard treatment option. And with this demonstration authority, you could see a scenario where we could take an intervention like that to scale in a state and see whether it reduces cases coming on to SSI or SSDI. States could receive incentive funding if they demonstrate success at improving employment outcomes for the target population. States would not be rewarded for simply tightening DDS eligibility reviews. These ideas have parallels with aspects of what David has just proposed, and certainly look forward to discussing differences during the discussion time. So finally, we would recommend learning from what Rich has discussed and testing out ways for employers to have a much greater role. Our intent would be to both test the concepts of experience rating, but also the improved private disability insurance role that David Otter and Mark Duggan have discussed. We would propose a voluntary subsidy-based test and realize that that would only partially simulate true experience rating, but nevertheless, we could learn much about developing, measuring, and evaluating incidents by employers. We would also see a role for involving private disability companies in testing out ways to be able to keep people in the workforce and not on SSDI, and using the private DI companies more effectively than we do now. We are emphasizing testing because there are many unknowns in this area. One key concern is the potential for employers to discriminate against those with disabilities. And I think that risk of hiring discrimination is serious, and we certainly welcome suggestions to address it, but we don't think those concerns are such that we should not do experimentation in this area, We know an existing employer has the greatest self-interest to accommodate someone, especially individuals, experiencing impairments late in life. In contrast, states might be better positioned to intervene with youth with disabilities. So in addition to those kind of 3 aggressive areas of demonstrations, we recommend some immediate actions that can be taken to improve the existing determination process. In general, we'd start with the observation that the discretionary appropriations process has done a poor job optimizing the funding to administer mandatory programs. And we should be striking a balance between what we fund on administrative monies and what we fund on program spending, so that overall we're minimizing federal spending. Instead, if you look at the appropriations process, as people earlier have noted, we have a backlog of 1.4 million continuing disability reviews, and as a consequence, we're needlessly adding to federal program costs. We've also created an incentive for the agency to prioritize reducing backlogs over a more comprehensive eligibility review process. I think some of the problems discussed earlier this morning are kind of rooted in the fact that SSA is very constrained in what it can spend on its eligibility process. We would propose to switch to mandatory funding for SSA's budget for state DDSs and provide SSA greater authority to manage DDS performance. Other major federal programs, such as Medicaid and SNAP, already have mandatory state administrative funding. With this authority, SSA could develop an enhanced appeals resolution process. The work that Joanne Barnhart accomplished as commissioner shows the opportunity that exists for an enhanced second-level review. And whether that's best done as a federal reviewing official or whether that's done as an enhanced DDS authority is something SSA should research. But the fundamental notion is that right now, SSA performs a very low cost, very minimal second-level review. And in 20% of the country, it performs no second-level review. If a person is denied in that initial application, they immediately go to the administrative law judge. And I certainly recognize there's difficulties at the ALJ level. I think we're recommending focusing first and improving the DDS level because the majority of allowances are made at that level. Even though there's much attention at the ALJ level, that's actually a subset of the overall allowances. And so we should first fix the initial stage in the second level review and have a better determination at that stage. And we can actually, I think, allow more cases that should have been allowed or are being allowed at the ALJ level, at the same time bringing better evidence to the ALJs for those cases that are denied. At the same time, SSA would establish performance goals for timeliness of initial determinations. SSA would have the authority to move work from low-performing states to high-performing states and improve the consistency across states. We would also implement a multi-year plan to eliminate the CDR backlog, again using mandatory funding. SSA would improve and standardize the collection of evidence and test protocols for assessing claims. SSA is doing some work now with NIH that's very exciting in that area. We would also establish national standards for the certification of medical and vocational experts and expand the cadre of such experts. This is really building on what Joanne talked about earlier in terms of needing a stronger basis there. I'm out of time, but just overall, I think we can improve the quality of the process. I think we can also modestly reduce the overall allowance rates. We've identified this, that we can save money while actually improving the outcomes for the individuals. Thank you.
And now our final proposal of fundamental reform, Jason Turner.
Good
According to my chart here, exactly 9.
It's a fair question. Our proposal from the Secretary's Innovation Group with Eloise Anderson, who's Wisconsin Secretary, as our chair, is based on a return of the disability programs, both SSDI and SSI, to the states. We know that the likelihood that this will pass the Congress and be signed into law is low. But I think it offers us a way to talk about the problem in ways that we can think about solutions within what may be a politically realistic context. So what I'd like to do here today is just describe that we have three parts to our program. I'd like to focus on the second. The first is that we would transfer both the budget and the operational responsibility from the federal government through a formula to states for both SSI and SSDI. At that point, the states would have the option the requirement to run the program under federal guidelines, but with substantial operational flexibility, much the way they currently do under TANF. And finally, they would have a range of things that they could do to set up a program in such a way that it would maximize the return to work and maximize health and well-being. But what those options are would not be prescribed. But we heard on our panel before this one some interesting ideas that are already in use in the area of workers' compensation. So in my short period of time, I'm going to actually just compare the system incentives which are in place in the current federal disability system with that in something of an idealized welfare system post-1995. I say idealized because this is government. It doesn't always work in execution the way it is intended, but we're going to run through it. So if you take a look at the comparison between the two and what some of the characteristics are that are different, under disability, funds are 100% federal for benefits, and the benefits and administration are separate. That's been a problem that's been talked about, so I won't talk about it anymore here, but that's a problem with Get Back to Work, isn't it? Whereas under TANF, the funds are fixed and then the benefits and admin are unified in such a way that if you help people go back to work, you can accrue savings which can be used for work support and prevention, and that's actually happened on a large scale. Very little TANF now goes to benefits of the overall block grant. It's mostly work supports. Disability is process-driven. You walk into an office, you go through a process, you come out the other end, you either have benefits or you don't. TANF is outcome-driven. There's 4 purposes of TANF. Well, the first one is to promote job preparation, work, and marriage to reduce dependency, and there's 3 others. Under disability, there's no prevention. Under TANF, the focus is on prevention. As an example, when you walk into a welfare office in most states, you're asked to look for work while your application is pending. You don't get on welfare first and then go to work. You're not supposed to. You're trying to divert people from the dependency system and into the labor market. That's the intention there. That's the area of prevention. Under disability, the focus is on calculating the limitations to employment. That's what you're supposed to do. But in TANF, the focus is on overcoming or accommodating limitations to employment. Why you got there? Well, let's figure out what we can do to get you out and in the labor force. And in TANF, simultaneous work activity is part of the health solution, the health and well-being solution. So if you can't find private employment that will make you independent of the need for TANF, then the system offers alternatives to keep you active in work activity until such time as you can move into the labor force. So work becomes integrated as part of the health solution, not distinct from. Under disability, it's culture neutral, right? You walk into an office, and the applicant is the autonomous decision maker. He or she decides, I'm either going to try and stay in the labor force or I'm going for disability. Nobody says anything about that decision. It's up to the individual. But in TANF, it's culture normative. Work is a shared decision. You don't walk into a welfare office and say anymore and say, give me money. Society has an interest in self-reliance. And in fact, what we know from the operation of TANF is that the caseworkers communicated this normative idea that you should work to the recipients, to the applicants, and that alone had a major impact on back to work, quite distinct from the operation of the back to work program itself. Under disability, there's a private profit incentive that's mixed up, certainly with lawyers. Under TANF, the profit incentive can be put to work for health and well-being, and increasingly the states are contracting with the private sector on a pay-for-performance basis, so that they define the objective and allow the business to try and achieve that objective. We heard Mark talk something like that in his remarks as it relates to bundling. Under disability, the mental reach for safety and security is a lifetime guarantee, but your income is unchanged over time, or it goes up slowly. Whereas the reach for safety, as communicated by the system, is it's not TANF. That's not where you're going to end up. That's temporary, and it's not much. What you need to look at is a basket of things: wages, EITC, child care, food stamps. Your income is changeable over time, so you're in a mix where you're trying to improve your circumstances. You're not dealing with the iron, what I call the iron rice bowl. Under disability, there's uncoordinated interactions among the major actors: physicians, employers, and the state. And I think Jennifer's presentation was particularly consequential on that. And in TANF, the system responses can be unified and seamless. They don't have to be. But this is the New York City process. You're not supposed to be able to read everything there. Just when somebody comes into the office in New York City and says, "I can't work because my doctor says I can't work," what the system does then, it creates a biopsychosocial assessment, and then tries to work with a functional orientation to match people with what they can do. So they go in there, and at the end, they get an assessment that says, "I can do sit, stand, walk, lift," and then they match that up. The caseworker does, the welfare caseworker matches it up with what work is available. This is not a pilot program. It's been operating. These are the results from 2005, but it's been operating for 12 years. So you can go see it, and these are the results. We don't have yes or no, we have gradations. There's risk involved with gradations. Joanne mentioned what they are. In the current system as it's designed, you could end up with more people on disability. But here, under this state system, we have those options. 42,000 plans have been completed in New York over 12 years. 12,000 of these led to employment, and 21,000 went on to SSI. So here you have a system where it's front end. We try and keep you in the labor force. If we can't do it, okay, then move on. But we did our best at the front door. Finally, disability has an absence of vibrant experimentation. I think everybody's addressing that in one way or another. But here in TANF, you've got 50 state programs, a variety of ideas going on all the time. So it's not just there's 51 shots. It's 50 things going all the time and changing year by year. In Wisconsin, they've changed the program from at least 3 or 4 different times and different orientations as they made progress and figured out what works. Okay, what you need, state skin in the game. You've got to have the guy that's paying the bill responsible for operations and outcome. Once you divide those two as it is in the current system, it's a recipe for disaster. You need operational flexibility, of course, to improve outcomes, but the eligibility criteria, in theory, although it should be changed, need not be changed for this to be a successful system. Thank you.
Now we have our respondent, Doug Besheroff.
Woo! What a lot of information. I was not here last week, but I hear that was an even more active discussion. And I also don't have overheads because I wanted to hear what was happening today. I have a total of 10 minutes, I think. I better watch my watch because people are brutal. Hey, see that, Joanne? See what it takes? It takes Ron not being in the room. Thank you. Well, we'll see what happens. Anyway, Jason said that I should step back, think about this a little bit, and react. I think that means if you're my age, you get to, not have to do overheads and not have to do too much research. The issue here was fundamental reform. And you had a big argument last week. You had a little argument today about how big is the problem. Is this a runaway problem? Are we going to go broke? There are enough other reasons why we're going to go broke, so maybe this will help us a little bit, I don't know. But that surely affects the view of what is needed. If you think that the problems are manageable, that this is largely driven by demographics, then I don't want to use the word marginal, I just used it. The fixes to the operational systems then become more attractive and more likely to be the ones that you propose. If you think that this is a more serious problem that involves not only the possibility of many more people receiving disability, both workers, former workers, and children, and I don't think we've talked enough about the problems there. And if you look at the overall labor force participation in this country, which is now, I think, hovering in the 60s, 60%, lowest in a long time, then you might have a more urgent view about the problem. I'm not here going to try to pick sides. In my other writings, I do think this is a serious problem, but for this discussion, I'm being a reactor. We have two sides of this argument. All the speakers described unbelievably ridiculous procedures. Now, I'm sure there's another side to some of this. I'm sure there's some reason why that judge who overturns the denials 98% of the time gets a certain kind of case and so forth. And I'm sure there are explanations for this. So be it. But all the speakers seem to feel that there are serious problems in the system that have to be addressed. Dave Stapleton, Jack have talked about major research efforts to learn better about the programs that we have. Again, if you think that the problems that we face are not major, aren't going to drive our economy or our federal budget broke, you're more willing to take that kind of incremental approach. If you think more urgent action is needed, you want to take more and more immediate action. But what I take away from their discussion, and the discussions all day today and the papers from last week, is I'm amazed at how little of this discussion is agency-driven. It's almost like they're missing from this discussion. Now, I know maybe the right people weren't invited and so forth, but looking at this, this looks like a situation in which the management structure, the incentive structure, whether it's at the federal level or at the state level, doesn't have this right. We're not generating reform internally, and that, I think, is a serious issue. So I teach, I need a test. So I have 3 tests for any criteria, for any proposal. The first is, does the proposal address the systemic problems of the system? That is, does it get the incentives right? Does it create management structures that lead the federal government to change its policies, whether it's ALJs or whatever, send out a new rule, not wait 10 years? Are there structures and incentives that the states should adopt? And if I had enough time, the incentives that employers and employees or those on the program should adopt. The tricky part about this is we're in the Congress. The Congress is not good at detail. So what I would say is a proposal, a fundamental reform proposal, has to be simple and systematic. That is, it has to change the chairs on the Titanic so that they work a little better. The second point I want to make is I'm struck that in the discussion so far, it looks like there are a bunch of winners and there are a bunch of losers. And that is to say, any change will help some aspects of the stakeholders, but other stakeholders are out. And if you look at successful legislation in the past, whether it was gun control under President Clinton or welfare reform, under President Clinton. You'll notice that a very dramatic systemic change that moved the meter pretty far in one direction was accompanied by something on the other side as well. For gun control, back in 1993, there were 100,000 cops put on the streets, I think. I'm looking at Jack, something like that. And so conservative Republicans were able to go back to their districts and say, I hated that gun control bill, but we got 100,000 cops. In welfare reform, people don't remember President Clinton held back until he got more child care than he should have in the bill. I'm looking at Jack again. But there were winners on both sides, and you want a negotiation where there are winners on both sides. So my second test for, quote, fundamental reform is we need to have some other people who win, even if we're going to be tightening whatever eligibility there is. And for that, again, I only have 9 3/4 minutes total, not now. But it does seem to me that missing from this conversation, it came up a little bit, are the ADA side of this discussion. I know so many people whose children have a disability where they need additional help. And if it is true that there are people on these programs who have other options, and if the targeting is not just to save federal money, but to improve the services to families and children who need it and individuals, I think that's going to be part of the answer. Third, any test of fundamental reform, and I don't know if there's anyone here from CBO, is going to be how is it scored? Which is to say, I think it's the case that it's extremely difficult to spend new money this year, next year, or the year after. In some respects, this is quite insidious because what it means is it will drive reform to things that are either cost neutral or much more likely, in a scenario I want to close with, much more likely we'll have to save money. There's some probability, I won't say it's some possibility, I won't say it's a probability, that we're going to go to some kind of major budget deal in the next period of months or years, maybe after the 2014 legislative congressional elections. We'll see what happens. In that deal, people are going to be looking for ways to save money. Now, I happen to agree with Jason that if you put a job search requirement or something like that on these programs, you will save money. I agree with Rich Burkhauser that if you experience rate, and I'm not sure why we need to experiment, but we could have that conversation later, behavior will change. I'd be real surprised if CBO scored either one of those ideas as a savings. And I think that means that people seeking to reform the system will be driven to a block grant where CBO is forced to say it's a savings. So I'm not saying it's going to happen, but if I look at what the package of the most likely fundamental reform is, it's got to be something that's systematic. It's got to be something that brings in people. There have to be winners on both sides of the argument. It has to be scored as a savings, and I think that means block grant help to the states. Does that mean I support it? Does that mean I think it should happen? Neither is necessarily the case, but I don't see, listening to everyone, if you believe you've got to get control over the total caseload and how it's growing, I don't see how you do that without systematic change. And systematic change will be heavy lifting on the part of politicians. If you remember what happened under Ronald Reagan when they tried to make some changes and they were demonized. So I don't think the politicians do this unless they have the reward of saying, we've saved some money. I've been told to stop. I'm done anyway. Thank you very much.
We have a few minutes for Q&A, so please raise your hands and I will call on you. Do we have any questions? Yes, sir. Do we have a microphone coming up? Here it is, sir.
I understand the discussion is weighing heavily on jobs, but some of those individuals are not even interested in working. There are other issues that are there, and so there needs to be some systematic changes, maybe with the Small Business Administration being involved, or some way that they give those individuals the opportunity to perhaps go in business for themselves and not go work for a job. This is America, the economy, you know, so there's ways and opportunities for everyone, and maybe they should have other opportunities presented to them, such as, you know, setting up their own business. And I guess at the SBA, if that would get involved, that would be a good way to kind of help them and provide them some other options, you know, not only just going to go work, but also to help improve the economy through small business.
Anyone want to comment on that? Okay. Yes.
So I just want to respond to the scurrilous charge that I want more research. So, and it may have come out that way, but actually, you know, I think there's not really very much chance at all that Congress is going to approve a major structural reform that's given the evidence base that we have now. I mean, I think there are lots of good ideas, and you know, I could probably pick one or two that I'd approve, but I don't think Congress is going to approve. And so what I was really trying to do was restructure the system now, very quickly, so that it would incentivize pushing forward with pilots at a much faster rate than we've ever had in the past. Now, that does involve some research, but I think it's much more rapid development research. And I think if you look at the other proposals you've seen for major reform, you know, they're not ready to go. It's going to take a lot of work to get there. So,
I think, Henry, you have two people who want to respond.
Yeah, that's fine. I wanted to see some indication of that.
I would largely agree with what David said, and I think if you harken back to welfare reform, I mean, before '96, there was a period of experimentation between AFDC, Medicaid, and food stamps. And where I differ a little bit with David's proposal is that during that process, each of the agencies running those programs were accountable for the waivers and for the experiments that were done. And many times there were experiments across the programs, and so you had to deal with interagency issues. We don't have that evidence base in this area, and so we need to do that kind of creative experimentation, and we need to challenge the agencies to open themselves up for that and consider trade-offs between VR and Medicaid and between Social Security programs and those programs. And until we've done that, we really aren't prepared to do the systemic change. I think we can spend money on that experimentation, we can save money on a better determination process, and overall actually have it be fiscally responsible.
My turn. So I'd be much more impressed with the idea of experimentation and research if we concluded the other programs that serve the disabled and the broader problem of labor force participation in this country. It's not just the disability programs. It ought to be TANF, right? It ought to be UI. It ought to maybe be SNAP. And it certainly should be WIA and other job training programs that are available in some kind of super waiver. And I think many of us believe that you could put that package together in the absence of politics and in the absence of congressional committees that have very individual jurisdictions and learn a lot about the needs of American workers. I actually think it'll be more likely we get a block grant than we get a super waiver.
Yes, ma'am.
Jason mentioned something that I don't understand very much about, but when we did do a project for Social Security, it became clear that in the president's budget is the cost of administering Social Security benefits, but in some other kind of like magical unconsidered budget is the actual cost of the program. And then you said that in moving it to the states, you would then somehow get that loss cost, what we in insurance would call the whole loss cost, would now be available. You could start investing some of what you used to pay in benefits in preventive services. Can you just talk about what the obstacles to making that happen would be? Because that sounds like it's essential.
Well, as we all know, over and over again, one of the major problems that we have that's described over and over about reform is you can't invest benefit savings in loss prevention or back to work. In TANF, that used to be the case, where you had a separate admin budget and a benefits budget. And when it went to a block grant, that block grant then was a fixed allocation with a state contribution. But at that point, the state was permitted to make adjustments to save money by helping people go to work and reuse that money in related areas. So a lot of money went in, for instance, to child care. Some of it went into the state earned income tax credit to get people back to work. Some went into contracts. It seems to me that we can't maintain that distinction and have to go to Congress each time to get an increase in the admin budget to help fund and run programs for back to work without the savings being used to help fund those programs.
Yes, we have time for 2 questions, maybe 3 very quick ones. But seeing none, we'll jump straight forward to the concluding comments by Eloise.
I want to start off with saying thank you for being here, and the secretaries are very excited about being part of this. And I want to sort of take a little time not to go over everything everybody did, but to kind of tell you where we are and why we're doing this. There are quite a few of us. We think we're forward thinkers. We run programs. We have a lot of skin in the game. Most of it is our own personal skin in the game. But we are rethinking support programs. Our objectives in rethinking those are health and well-being of our state residents as foremost. We're rethinking work. And I think that one of the things that I've observed over the years, work has changed. I don't know if our thinking about work has changed, but work has changed. Wisconsin is a manufacturing state. And when I go into a manufacturer now, people who used to make, I used to say dirty places, most of those are very clean places. They use a lot of machinery, a lot of technology. So what those of us who go through 4 years, 6 years, 8 years of college know about work, a lot of the work that the rest of the world does is very limited. And so we build our notions about how our programs ought to be for the skilled and unskilled about work we know nothing about. And so our whole notion of work and how we look at work needs to be updated. And in doing that, I'm saying rethink work. The other thing that we know about work, maybe people here in Washington don't know about work, is that work integrates people into the community. And when people don't work, they become isolated from the community. People who work have better health. Even when they are sick, they have better health. They have better outcomes. They have less depression and longer lives. The other thing that we know is that more people who don't work commit suicide. So we need to start thinking about that. We also know, I know we don't like to think about this, but people who don't work commit murder. So the outcomes for not working are pretty terrible. We think that if we get more people to work, we'll have less constraints on our workforce participation. I know most people look at the unemployment rate. I continually look at the workforce participation rate, and I'm sorry, it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. We have less and less people who are working, and our businesses in our state are constantly saying, we don't have people in these jobs. We don't have the skills for these jobs. We need more people. And I think that the people that we have on disabilities could actually do many of these jobs. So rethink work is our second piece. Now, we're looking at a couple of programs that we believe that we should run. We believe that we should put our applied knowledges to them. Those are SSI, SSDI, UI, and food stamps. We think the states can do a better job, which also means if we take over these, on the way to taking over them, we have to think differently about the whole notion of the safety net. And I know we're having a hard time coming to, well, what is a safety net in 2013 and what should it be in 2015? But I think we need to have discussions around that. The other thing I think we have to get past, and I say this gingerly, is the whole notion of states doing something. I know that there's a whole view out there that the states are still living in 1865. Well, we don't live in 1865. Most of us are very good about doing things, and many of us have changed. But if you're in Washington looking at us, I think you still think that we're in 1865. So states have moved, states have changed, and I believe states are the applied position here. We want a block grant approach. I know that getting DC to get there is a slow process, more like a turtle moving, but I think in some cases we're willing to take even a slower approach, which is a waiver route. And I remember when we went for waivers under AFDC, and it wasn't easy. So we want to introduce work, we want to introduce case management, and we want to introduce services. We do not want to continue the siloed approach. We want a realignment, and we want the people here to think realignment. TANF, we believe, started this movement. We want to move forward with that. When I look at TANF and what we learned, what we did with TANF was to change TANF, but we didn't change SSI. We had people throwing flags up around TANF saying, you know what, you got a population in TANF that can work, but they need special things to work, or they can't work. And so because we never paid attention to that, we did TANF without aligning TANF to SSI. I believe we need to align TANF to SSI and DVR, and I think we need to rethink about DVR and what their priorities are so we can get more people to work. And I believe that if we do SSI, TANF, food stamps, UI, and SSDI, I think you'll see a huge shift in who goes to work and how our communities work. The states could provide the thinking. All the states won't do it alike. Some of the states might not even be interested in it. It isn't that why we have 50 states who all do things differently, and that isn't that why the 50 states are the laboratories of innovation. Try us, you might like us. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists, all of our discussants, all of our participants, and I'd particularly like to thank our partners in the sponsorship of this, the Secretary's Innovation Group and the Brookings Institution. Thank you very much for your attendance, and I hope we've given you lots of food for thought.